She did not know the man at her table was the man who had come to kill her son. She only saw a stranger with cracked lips and no money in his pocket, and she did what she had done for 40 years on that porch. She slid an empty plate across the wood and told him the cook was feeling generous today. She filled the plate with chicken and rice and beans, and she watched him eat. She did not know that 900 meters away, behind a stained automotive shop, sat the safe house her son used between runs. She did not know the stranger had a satellite radio under the floorboards of his rented room, and she did not know that on the back of his hand, hidden by a smear of engine grease, was a small tattoo of an anchor, the seal of the unit that had come to her village to end everything she loved. And she would never know, because of what she did next, that mercy is a kind of weapon too. To understand what happened on that Tuesday afternoon in the late spring of 2023, in a village whose name the federal government will not release even now, you have to understand the woman first, and the road she walked to reach that empty plate. Her name was Doña Speranza Reina. She was 64 years old. Her hair was the color of wet iron, pulled back in a braid that reached the small of her back, and her hands were the hands of a woman who had been cooking for other people since she was 11. She had been widowed at 32 when her husband Ramon, a truck driver, fell asleep on the highway between Mazatlan and Culiacan and went off the road into a ravine that did not give him back. She had buried him on a Sunday. On Monday she opened her front door, dragged her late husband's workbench out onto the porch, scrubbed it down with lye, and started cooking for whoever would walk past. That was how the comedor began: 3 plastic tables, a metal awning, a hand-painted sign that said only ESPERANZA in red. She had raised her only son on it. She had raised him alone. She had raised him well, or so she had told herself for 25 years, even after the rumors started, even after the new trucks, even after the men with sunglasses who came to ask after him and call him sir. His name was Joaquin. The village called him El Rabel, the Oak, because as a boy he had been the kind of child who did not bend, who took beatings from older boys without crying and walked home with his back straight and his lips white. He had grown up to be a man who did not bend either, only now what would not bend in him was something darker, something his mother could feel in the room when he hugged her and did not ever ask about. He came home every Sunday. He brought her flowers from the market in Culiacan, and a bottle of rompope, and an envelope of money she put into a coffee tin behind the refrigerator and pretended not to count. He kissed her forehead. He ate 2 plates of whatever she had cooked. He sat on the porch and watched the road, and sometimes a black SUV idled at the end of her street with its windows down, and sometimes men she did not recognize nodded to him as they passed. She did not ask. He did not tell. They had built, over the slow accretion of 25 Sundays a year, a small, careful silence between them, and inside that silence she could still see the boy who had skinned his knee on the church steps when he was 4 years old and run to her crying, and that was the boy she fed. There were nights, of course, when the silence pressed against her. She would lie in the iron-frame bed her husband had left her, with the Saint of Widows nailed above the headboard, and listen to the dogs of the village arguing with the wind. She had seen the news. She was not a woman who read it, but she had a television in the kitchen, and the television showed faces and trucks and bodies covered with white sheets. And once, in 2017, it had shown a face she had thought, for one cold second before the anchor moved on, was her son's. It had not been him. She had crossed herself. She had turned the television off. She had walked out onto the porch in the dark and said to no one, "Whatever he is still the boy who skinned his knee." This was the bargain she had made with God or with herself or with the empty space between them. She would not look and she would not lie and she would not stop feeding him. The plate was the only language she still trusted. The other man, the man who would come to her table, was named Daniel Ortega. He was 41 years old. He was a captain in the Mexican Naval Special Forces, SCMAR, and he had been in her village for 9 days when he sat down at her table, and he had a tattoo of an anchor on the back of his right hand, which he had been covering each morning with a smear of grease from a borrowed wrench. He had come to her village in a battered white Nissan pickup with electrician's tools in the bed and a clipboard on the dashboard, and he had introduced himself to everyone he met as Daniel Suarez from Mazatlan, a traveling electrician looking for piecework. He had rewired a butcher's freezer. He had fixed a street lamp on the church corner. He had drunk Coca-Cola in 3 different cantinas and listened to who spoke too loudly about whose nephew worked where. He had a phone with 2 SIM cards. He had a satellite radio hidden under the floorboards of the small concrete room he rented from a widow named Carmen, and twice a night he transmitted 3-line reports back to a base he could not name. His mission, the mission for which the unit had been planning for 11 months, was simple in the way that all terrible things are simple. He was to confirm the location of El Rabal's regional safe house, identify the windows of the building, count the men inside on any given day at any given hour, and on the morning he was ready, he was to call in a strike. He was very good at his job. He had run 9 such operations before. None of them had failed. By the Tuesday of the 2nd week, he had already found the safe house. It sat 800 meters from Doña Esperanza's porch, on the back lot of an automotive shop whose owner had been bought 12 years earlier, hidden behind a row of dead palm trees and a chain-link fence the cartel kept rusted on purpose so it would not glint in satellite imagery. Daniel had walked past it 6 times. He had seen 3 different men on 3 different days. He had heard the low cough of a generator running at hours. No honest shop would need power. He had the coordinates. He had the windows. He had the count. All he needed now was a date, and a quiet morning, and a clear sky over Sinaloa. He had worked in his short time in the village, in the particular silence of a man who is taking the measure of a place he is about to break. He memorized the dogs by their barks. He memorized which doors creaked. He memorized the schedule of the school bus, and the route of the trash truck, and the hour the priest unlocked the side door of the church to sweep. He learned the name of every child who played in the dirt lot across from the safe house, because in the planning room a child's name on a satellite map was the difference between an operation that closed clean and an operation that ended a career. He memorized the position of the village's only ambulance, parked behind the volunteer fire station, 3 streets to the east, and the hour the single doctor came in on Wednesdays. He had been trained to do this. He had been trained, more than anything, not to feel any of it. The training had always held. He had never, in 9 operations, woken in the middle of a night and found himself trying to put a face to a coordinate. He did not yet know that this one would be different. He did not yet know that the village was about to do to him what no village had ever done. That Tuesday afternoon, he came down the dirt street toward the comedor because he had just spent his last 37 pesos on a phone charger from a hardware stall, and the charger did not work, and he was tired, and he was hungry, and he had calculated that if he ordered only water and sat in the shade for 40 minutes, no one would notice him pretending. He did not yet know about her. He had walked past the porch twice before without registering it. But on that Tuesday, the sky was the color of old tin, and the wind smelled like rain that would not arrive, and the smell of chicken with garlic and chilies was rolling off her stove in a way that made his stomach hurt, and so he sat. He took the plastic chair nearest the wall. He folded his hands. He ordered water in a low voice. And he watched the road, because watching the road was a habit he could no longer turn off, and because watching the road was what he had been sent to her village to do. She watched him for almost 4 full minutes before she moved. She had been a widow long enough to read men by the way they sat, and what she read in this one was not danger and not appetite, but something quieter and worse. The careful stillness of a man who is counting his coins under the table and finding them too few. She had seen it on 100 travelers, and on her own husband once, the morning before he found work driving the truck. She wiped her hands on her apron. She walked the 4 steps from the stove to his table. She did not ask him what he wanted. She slid a plate in front of him, white and chipped and empty, and she said, "Joven, when the cook fills it, you pay." Today the cook is feeling generous. And before he could refuse, before he could even pull together the lie that he had been about to tell her about a wife in Mazatlan waiting on a bank transfer, she had turned, walked back to her stove, and ladled chicken and rice and beans into the plate until it was heavy in his hands. She set a stack of warm tortillas wrapped in a blue cloth beside it. She said, "Eat slow. The road will still be there," and she went back to her work. This was the inciting moment, although neither of them knew it yet, not the meal, not the words, but the thing inside Daniel Ortega that the meal cracked open. He ate. He ate slowly, because she had told him to, and he ate cleanly, because he had been trained to leave no trace anywhere. And when he was done, he tried twice to leave money on the table, and twice she walked over and pushed the empty pesos back into his hand and closed his fingers around them. The second time she did it, she patted the back of his hand, exactly where the anchor tattoo lay hidden under its smear of grease, and she said, "Mijo, save it for the road." And then she went on with her day, and Daniel Ortega walked back to his rented room with a stomach full of her chicken and a feeling in his chest he did not yet have a name for, and he sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the floorboards under which his radio waited, and he did not move for almost an hour. For 3 more days he watched. He told himself this was operational discipline. He went back to the comedor twice, once on Wednesday for coffee, which she let him pay for, and once on Thursday for a bowl of puzzle, which she did not. He learned her name from a neighbor. He learned the name of her son from no one, because no one in the village said it out loud, but he already knew it because his briefing folder had carried it in red ink on the cover for 11 months. He learned that her husband had died on a highway. He learned that she had not missed a Sunday cooking for her boy in 25 years. He learned from old Carmen, his landlady, that Doña Esperanza had paid for the new roof on the village school out of her own coffee tin, and that the priest had once tried to refuse her tithe because he suspected where some of the money behind it came from, and that she had stood in the church doorway and told him, very softly, that the bread on the altar did not ask whose field it had grown in. Daniel wrote none of this in his reports. He wrote only the count of men at the safe house, and the coordinates, and the suggested time of strike, Friday morning at 5. Then on Thursday afternoon, El Rabel arrived. He arrived 2 days early. There was no operational reason for it, only that he was, beneath every other thing he had become, a man who missed his mother and had finished a job in Mazatlan a day ahead of schedule, and so he had pointed the SUV toward Culiacan and driven home. Daniel saw the convoy come down the main road at 4 in the afternoon, 3 vehicles, the middle one a black Suburban with smoked windows, and he watched from the doorway of the hardware stall as the Suburban slowed in front of the comedor, and a man in a gray button-down shirt stepped out. He was tall. He had his mother's eyes. He walked up the 3 steps of the porch, and Doña Esperanza came out of the house and stopped on the top step and put both her hands against her son's chest, the way a woman stops a horse, and then she lifted onto her toes and kissed his forehead the way she had kissed him when he was a boy. And Daniel Ortega, Captain Daniel Ortega of SEMAR, who had run 9 of these operations and never hesitated, felt something pass through him that was not training and not protocol and not even fear. It was recognition. He saw, in the way she put her hands on her son's chest, the way his own mother had once put her hands on his chest when he had come home on his first leave from the academy. His mother, who had died in 2019 of a cancer the family could not afford to chase down. His mother, who had fed him every Sunday of his childhood out of a pot that always seemed too small for what came out of it. He walked back to his rented room. He did not eat that night. He sat on the bed, and he laid out the strike order on the cement floor in front of him, 3 pages of pre-typed authorization, with a single blank line at the bottom where his initials would go. He reviewed his oath. He thought about the 11 other operations he had run, the warehouse in Veracruz where they had taken a man named Caballo alive at 3 in the morning, the speedboat off the coast of Nayarit, the apartment in Tijuana with the dog he had to step around. He had never hesitated. He had not been the kind of man who hesitates. He had told a younger officer once, in the back of a transport plane, that hesitation was not a moral position. It was only the body's way of refusing what the mind already understood. He had believed that. He sat with the strike order for 6 hours. He thought about his mother. He thought about the empty plate. He thought about how it would happen, the helicopters at 5 in the morning, the breach team, the flashbangs, the small rolling pressure wave that goes through a house at the same instant as the door, and how Doña Esperanza, 800 meters away, would wake in the dark and hear the rotors and walk out onto her porch in her nightdress, and how someone from the village would come running and tell her, and how she would stand on those 3 steps where she had just kissed her son's forehead, and how she would not scream. Because women like her do not scream, but how something inside her would close and stay closed for the rest of whatever life she had left. He thought about every Sunday of his own childhood, when his own mother had fed him out of a pot too small. He thought about the words she had said when he was 9 years old, and asked her how she always had food for him when there was so little. She had said, "Mijo, the plate is never as empty as it looks." He thought about that for a long time. He thought, too, about the oath he had taken in a courtyard in Veracruz when he was 24 years old, in the gray hour before sunrise, with a rifle across his back and a brand new flag pin on his collar, and a chest so full of his own seriousness he could barely breathe. He had sworn that morning to defend the Republic of Mexico against all enemies, foreign and domestic, with his life if necessary. He had not sworn, he understood this now, sitting on a thin mattress in a rented room with a folded strike order on the cement floor, to defend it against an old woman who slid empty plates across a wooden counter to strangers with empty pockets. He had not sworn to drag her, 800 meters away in her nightdress, into a war she had refused for 40 years to look at directly. He had sworn an oath, and he had eaten her chicken, and somewhere between those two things a third thing had grown that the oath did not cover and that the chicken did not name. He sat with it. He let it grow. He understood, finally, what it was. It was the simple weight of having been seen by a stranger as a hungry man and fed. And then he picked up the strike order. And he folded it once. And he folded it twice. And at 4 in the morning on Friday, he turned on his satellite radio and he made the call. He told them the intel was wrong. He told them the building behind the automotive shop was empty, a decoy. He told them the count had been off, that the men he had seen were day laborers being held for a different operation, that the generator was running for refrigeration of stolen meat, that the whole 11-month thread had unraveled in his hands in the last 72 hours, and he was recommending immediate abort and reassignment. His commander, a colonel named Vega who had known Daniel for 15 years and had buried 2 men under his command in the same week the year before, went very quiet on the other end of the line. He asked Daniel 3 questions. Daniel answered all 3. Then Vega said, "Captain, I am going to ask you one more time, and I want you to be very careful with your answer. Is the building empty?" And Daniel Ortega closed his eyes in the dark of his rented room, and he said, "Sir." The building is empty. And he held the line and he did not breathe, and after 13 seconds Vega said, "Stand down. We are pulling you out at 0600, and he hung up. The strike was called off. Within 48 hours, as cartels always do after any spike in government radio traffic on a frequency they monitor through paid sources at the carrier level, El Rabal's people moved the safe house. The trucks came in the night and the dead palm trees were uprooted, and the chain-link fence was rolled up, and the generator was carried out on the shoulders of 4 men. And by Sunday morning, the lot behind the automotive shop was nothing but oil-stained dirt with the shape of a building pressed into it like a footprint. Doña Esperanza, who lived 800 meters away, never heard a thing. 2 weeks later, in an operation that Daniel was not assigned to and would only read about in the after-action report, El Rabel was taken alive in a hotel room in a small town 40 miles to the east. The arrest was clean. No civilians were present. He surrendered without firing, because his security detail had been split that morning across 2 locations, and he had walked into the hotel alone, carrying a paper bag of pan dulce he had bought for a meeting that did not happen. He went into federal custody at 1 in the afternoon. By 6, he was in a helicopter going north. By the end of the month, he was in a cell in Almoloya, and by the end of the year, he had been sentenced to 50 years on charges that filled 22 pages. Daniel was investigated. Of course he was investigated. A captain does not lie on a strike call and walk away clean, and Vega, who had not believed a single word of Daniel's report from the moment he made it, opened a closed-room inquiry the following Monday. Daniel sat across from him in a small windowless office in Mexico City, and Vega asked him, off the record, what had happened in that village. Daniel did not give him the careful operational lie he had practiced on the flight. He looked at Vega across the desk and he said, very quietly, "Sir, I would not bring war to that woman's table." And Vega, who had a mother of his own, still alive in a village outside Oaxaca, looked at him for a long time, and then he stood up, and he went to the door, and he closed it the rest of the way, and he came back to his chair, and he said only, "You will be demoted. You will not be discharged. You will request a transfer. You will request something with no rifles." And Daniel said, "Yes, sir." And he requested, that afternoon, a transfer to an agricultural fraud unit working out of an office in Guadalajara, investigating the false labeling of avocados. 6 months passed. The summer rains came and went. Doña Esperanza in her village did not understand at first why her son had been taken, or by whom, or what it meant. She visited him in prison every month, a 14-hour bus ride each way that aged her another year each time she made it. And she sat across from him through bulletproof glass and put her hand against the glass, and he put his hand against the other side, and they did not always speak. The comedor stayed open. She cooked. She fed travelers. She fed the priest. She fed 2 engineers from the water company and a woman driving alone to a wedding in Hermosillo. She thought sometimes, in the cool hour before bed, about the thin, tired electrician who had come through her village in the spring, and she wondered if he had made it home to wherever home was. In the 7th month, a small padded envelope arrived at her porch with no return address. It had been mailed from Guadalajara. Inside was a stack of cash equivalent to roughly $200 American, the largest single gift she had ever received from a stranger, and a small white card. The card read in plain black ink in a hand she did not recognize, "For the plate you filled on a Tuesday, nothing else." She held it in her hands for a long time. She did not cry. She had not been a crier since she was 32. She put the cash into the coffee tin behind the refrigerator, and she put the card on a shelf above the stove. And 3 weeks later she walked into an appliance store in Culiacan, and she bought, in cash, a new commercial-grade refrigerator for the comedor, white and humming and large enough to hold a whole week's chickens. She never knew who had sent the money. She never tried very hard to find out. She understood, in the way certain old women understand, that some debts are paid in the dark. 2 years passed. Daniel Ortega left SCMAR. He completed his agricultural fraud rotation with a clean record and applied for early retirement, which was granted on a technicality and with no fanfare. He took his small pension and he bought a narrow storefront on a side street in Guadalajara, and he opened a small autoelectric repair shop with his own name on the sign, Ortega Autoelectrico, and he wired alternators and replaced fuses, and rebuilt the small dim things inside cars that other men could not be bothered with. He married a woman named Lucia who taught second grade at a school 2 blocks from the shop. They had a son. They named him Tomás. He turned out to have his father's quiet hands. Doña Esperanza in her village kept cooking. She was 66 now. Her hair was whiter at the temples. Her back ached on cold mornings. But the comedor was still open, and the new refrigerator hummed against the back wall, and on weekends she had help, because Joaquin's daughter, Rosa, had moved in with her. Rosa was 22. She was studying nursing at a school in Culiacan, and on weekends she came home and tied her hair back and worked the porch beside her grandmother, taking orders and pouring Jamaica, and learning the recipes that her grandmother had never written down and would not write down even now, because they were not, she said, the kind of recipes that survived ink. They survived hands. Rosa was learning to use her hands. And one afternoon in the spring of the 3rd year, a Tuesday, of course it was a Tuesday, Doña Esperanza was wiping down the counter behind the comedor and she stopped, and she looked up at the wall above the stove where the white card had stayed all this time, leaning against a tin of paprika, and she noticed something she had not noticed in 2 years. She lifted the card down. She turned it over. On the back, tucked into the seam where the paper had been folded once before it was put into the envelope, there was a small photograph, barely larger than a postage stamp, that had been taped to the inside of the card, and that she had never seen because she had never thought to look. It was a photograph of a baby boy in a blue knit cap. On the back of the photograph, in the same plain black ink, were 3 words and a year: Tomás, 4 months. Nothing else. She held the photograph in her old hands for a long time. She did not understand all of it. She understood enough. She walked across the kitchen, and she opened a small wooden frame she had been saving for a picture of Joaquin as a child, and she slid the photograph of Tomás into the frame, and she hung the frame on the wall behind the counter, beside the Saint of Travelers, where every stranger who sat at her plastic tables would see it without knowing whose son it was or why it was there. Rosa, coming through the door with a basket of tomatoes, saw her grandmother standing in front of the wall. She asked, "Abuela, who is that?" And Doña Esperanza, who did not know the man's name and did not know his rank, and did not know that on a Friday morning in the spring of 2023, he had folded a piece of paper twice and saved her son's life and her own without ever telling her, only smiled, and put her hand flat against the wall beside the photograph, and said, very quietly, "Mija, that is a boy whose father once ate at our table." And then she went back to the stove, because the beans needed turning, and the road outside the comedor was long, and there would be more travelers coming before the sun went down. She fed a stranger out of habit. The stranger held a button that would have ended her son's life. She never knew. He never told. And in a small village outside Culiacan, on a porch with 3 plastic tables, and a hand-painted sign that says only ESBERANZA in red, an old woman still slides empty plates across the wood to men with no money in their pockets, and tells them, in a voice as soft as flour, that the cook is feeling generous today. Some plates are full of more than food. Some mercies travel further than the hands that gave them. And sometimes, only sometimes, and never when we are looking, the kindness we hand to a stranger on a Tuesday afternoon is the only thing standing between the people we love and the dark.